Welcome. We'll be getting started in just a minute or so. Just let everybody in. Hope everyone is doing well today. For those of us here in the Northern Hemisphere, we're moving into a beautiful fall season after a pretty not exciting summer, wet and kind of dreary. So hopefully we'll have some nice fall weather. Yeah, and we'll be getting started shortly. Thanks everyone for your patience as we let people in and everyone gets settled. And as you're connecting, if you can make sure to put your phone on mute, that would be wonderful. Welcome, folks. Seeing some familiar names and faces. And please, if you have a chance to mute your phone, please do so, your phone or computer, to ensure that there's limited disruption. Really appreciate that. Thank you. All right, we have a good number of people coming in. Wonderful. Well, folks are still coming in, but I will just start out by welcoming you to this third of our three-part webinar series about some of those specific operational and technical challenges that come up when returning individual research results and data to research participants. My name is Sylvia Baydorf-Cassis. I'm a program director here at the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard. And I am thrilled to be able to have this conversation today, digging deeper with Megan Frone on genetic testing and returning genetic test results and responsibly returning secondary findings in genetic testing studies. Before we get into the meat of the content today, I'll be going over a few housekeeping items, and then we'll get into a little overview of the individual return of results project, and then, of course, into a discussion of today's case study with Megan. So first off, you'll probably notice you're all here in sort of a webinar, in a meeting, a Zoom meeting setting, which means you can kind of see who else is on the meeting with you. And this was done intentionally. You know, we've done a lot of webinars over the course of the pandemic where we all come in and you don't know who else is there, and you're kind of sitting there and you can't chat with other people because you don't know who else is there. And I really wanted to highlight in this session and in this series that you're all part of a community of people that cares about returning individual results and data to participants, something we hear again and again from the participant community that is an important priority for them and reason for participating in research. So take a look, and you can scroll through the list of participants, see who your colleagues are, your allies in the space, and you might be even surprised to see some folks that you didn't realize were working in the space and are here with you today. And maybe you'll make a new friend, someone in your organization or someone you didn't realize you want to connect with about this. Because it's a meeting, it means it does sometimes come with some of the issues with a Zoom meeting, such a situation like if you're unmuted, your voice and any audio from your computer or phone can disrupt this meeting. So please keep yourself on mute and use the chat function to submit your questions. And I will do my very best to keep on top of the chat and be able to make sure that we have ample opportunity for your questions to be answered. Closed captioning is also available. It has been enabled, but if you need it on your own and it hasn't been enabled on your own, you can go to the three dots in the More function and enable closed captioning. And then the only caveat for that is that you please keep it in English language, because if you change it, it changes it for everyone. And this is an English language webinar. It won't, if you change the captions, it doesn't offer translation, as amazing as it would be to do that. So please just keep it in English so that everyone can use the chat and keep it the closed captioning in English. And of course, the recording will be available within a few days. So if you can't stay for the whole thing, or you have colleagues who you think might be interested in this, please feel free to send that link to them. It will be available on our website in the near future. And Kaylee, my lovely colleague who works in the health literacy space with me, will be putting some of these links in so that you're able to get access to them. Before I get started, I'll also just note that these are my opinions and not necessarily the opinions of the speakers, or the opinions of Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard University, or other organizations or entities. And we're supported as an organization by a variety of different funding sources, but regardless of who funds us, we are committed to autonomy in our work and transparency in our relationships. And so we retain final control over any content of the products, results, and deliverables. And I have no personal conflicts of interest to disclose related to this presentation. So by now, if you've been part of the series, or you're here today, you know that the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center is a research and policy center based out of Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts. We have 2 offices. And our vision is to improve the integrity, safety, and rigor of global clinical trials. And we do that by developing standards, we establish best practices, identify opportunities for improvement in the clinical research space, and improve transparency. And we try to do all of that by engaging diverse stakeholders like many of you who are here today to define the emerging issues or the sustaining issues in global clinical trials. Sometimes we can't solve it right away and we need to keep working at it, to create and implement ethical, actionable, and practical solutions. And the practical nature of it is really what we're kind of talking about today, these case studies in individual return of results that we've been working on and releasing and discussing. And it's really around our work to improve transparency. And so that's what we're really striving for. The project itself on individual return of results started back in 2013 to 2017. And so the original toolkit was released back in 2017. And then a few years passed with that being in the atmosphere and the ecosphere of clinical research. Folks were using it, but we realized and we heard from many stakeholders there were still some updates that were needed to really bring it to the next step in terms of how to return, what to return, and grappling with some of those really challenging issues. So in 2021, a task force was created to update and add sort of operational and implementation-oriented tools and resources. That was run by project manager Lisa Murray back when she was with us. And that was released in March of 2022. And so I'll walk through the website just over a couple of slides in a minute. But the case studies were then developed over another year and released earlier this year in May. There was a webinar in May that launched the 3 cases, and you can actually access a video and the slides from that session if you're interested, and Kaylee will put that into the chat as well. And then there will also, we launched then, because of all of these questions and discussion that came up, we ended up doing this Digging Deeper series. So we had one session earlier this year with Paula Boyles from Pfizer talking about their patient data return solution. And then we had a session with Yale, with Linda Coleman and Madeline Baranowski talking about their experience of returning non-validated results during the pandemic. And so now we're doing this session with Megan Frone on genetic testing and some of the issues that come up with that. So the website itself, I want to highlight it because a lot of what we'll talk about today is going to talk about planning and preparation for returning results and thinking through it. And so the website itself is designed to really help you be able to know how to use it, how to get started, why to get started. If you're in a position where you're trying to make the case with your team, with your leadership and your organization, this section of the website gives you some great overview on the arguments to be made and the rationale behind why returning results is so important and should be prioritized as an initiative. We also have then under the how to return these stakeholder roadmaps that look at IRB roles, investigator roles, sponsor roles, and even a roadmap for participants in terms of deciding whether receiving results is something that's a priority for them and what are some considerations they might have. We also have some guidance on determining what to return and really thinking through that, and then the how, who, when, how, as well as result-specific guidance. There's also tools and templates for you to look at. Again, more resources for participants as they decide whether they want to receive specific types of information. And if you want to go back to the original guidance from 2017, you can do that there too. And of course, the case studies live there too. And we have these 5 that have been released, 3 that have been put into this Digging Deeper series. And so we're actually going to be talking about responsibly returning secondary findings today. And I want to thank the folks that worked on this, the work group that contributed to this new website and the individual return of results resources. And then of course, our case study authors, Jamie Tyrone and Doris Allen, and of course, Paula and Linda that I already mentioned. So without further ado, I will pass the baton on to Megan Frone, a wonderful colleague of mine who is a board-certified clinical genetic counselor. She's at the National Cancer Institute. She co-authored this case on responsibly returning secondary findings, and she's going to walk through the case with you all in case you haven't had a chance to look at it, over the high-level considerations, deliberations, and then we'll have a discussion, and I'll take your questions as best I can from the chat in order to foster more discussion and conversation. So here's our disclaimer for Megan, and then I will stop sharing and we'll just move into the presentation and discussion portion. Hi, Megan, welcome. So you're on mute, so let's get you off mute and
all right. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
I was muted. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm very honored to be here today to talk a little bit more about the case series. That was my boilerplate disclaimer. So even though I am a genetic counselor with the National Cancer Institute, today, all of the things that I'll be discussing are my own views. They don't represent any of the views of NCI or NIH or HHS or any other government entity. So the case series that we'll just kind of walk you through in the first little bit of the call today. And I don't know, generally people have it up in front of them, right? We're not going to share it on the screen, or do you want me to do that? You're muted now.
No need to share. Yeah,
Okay.
I printed it. Super exciting, right? But you can just walk through what you had described in it, and then, what some of the big issues came up, with this, planning this.
Yeah, I think we're all so interested in this topic because there isn't a rule book for this topic, right? And there's no right answer. There are certainly a lot of entities and a lot of really knowledgeable folks that are working on this in kind of all aspects and all areas. And there are a lot of resources that we can kind of share as we get into the discussion and as we get into the questions that I think have some really good guidance and roadmaps for how different institutions can think about doing all of this. But at the end of the day, outside of a couple more firm guidelines and maybe some regulatory aspects, there isn't a, do this and then this and then this for these sorts of complex things when we're thinking about returning of secondary findings. And so it's an area I think where I still have questions about certain aspects of this. And I feel like every time I have these sorts of conversations or these presentations, I learn new aspects that we could be implementing into return of secondary findings across both the clinical activities I do and the research activities I do. So when we were approached to come up with this case series and guide, This is actually, it's a hypothetical case. It came out of two real clinical cases that we kind of meshed and melded together to kind of create a real world scenario that would also highlight the various aspects that we wanted to highlight. So I do want to just also point out that it's like a hypothetical case. It's not an actual 100% real case, although all the pieces of it did happen in various different clinical scenarios. And so at the top, we kind of have the researcher roadmap for returning individual results, and just kind of thinking through when a research team is thinking about returning secondary findings, when they should be thinking about this. And the takeaway, I think, that I would want you all to take from this is that it is an ongoing process, and that you should be thinking about it every step of the way. And the other big piece I think that we really want you to take out of this is the planning piece is crucial, and thinking about this well before you're even writing your protocol is very crucial, to kind of be thinking through the various scenarios that you can encounter, thinking through your particular research study and your aims and what you'll be doing in your patient population, and then thinking through how best with the resources you have available that you're going to be handling return of secondary findings. And in some rare cases, like we'll talk about, maybe the answer is that you're not going to return secondary findings. That's also an appropriate option potentially for teams in some situations, right? It's not always going to be feasible or appropriate to return secondary findings, but we want to think through that really carefully and think through the risks and the benefits and the pros and the cons of that. So the case that we highlighted in this guide is a case of a pediatric, it's a case of an inherited bone marrow failure clinic, and a study that was looking at these inherited bone marrow failure syndromes. But during the course of the genetic sequencing, the team uncovers a pathogenic variant in the BRCA1 gene, which is a gene that is not associated with inherited bone marrow failure syndrome per se. Technically, there's a link to Fanconi anemia, but not in the case of the scenarios you read it. Basically, it's in the setting of a hereditary cancer predisposition syndrome, where they find a pathogenic variant in BRCA1, which leads to high risks for breast cancer and ovarian cancer and male breast cancer and some other cancers as well. So basically, this is a study team that's doing a study on inherited bone marrow failure, but they've done full whole exome sequencing. And so now they found this BRCA1 variant in this hereditary breast cancer, which is not something that they necessarily were focusing on as part of their research, but is something that's very important to the health of that participant and to potentially the health of family members, right? Because these sorts of things get passed on. These are all the things that we think about when we're thinking about genetic conditions. And so in our scenario, though, the study team has kind of appropriately thought through, hey, because we're going to be doing large scale sequencing and doing whole exome sequencing, we may be finding variants in other genes outside of our research scope. And they've already kind of lined that out in their protocol and decided what they're going to look at, how they're going to look at it, and how they're going to return it. So for them, it becomes a pretty smooth process for them to return this result to the participant, because it's already in their protocol. The patient was consented to say, hey, we may find these sorts of things. Would you want to know? They've consented to that. So they're able to contact the participant, say, hey, we found something in the course of research that may be a health implication. Do you want to know that? The participant said, yeah, I would want to know that. So then they're able to get a second sample, CLIA confirm the BRCA1 variant, and return it to the participant. And then that participant goes on to be plugged into their provider to start getting the care for hereditary breast ovarian cancer, and ended up undergoing prophylactic mastectomy and what they thought was prophylactic oophorectomy. And then they actually found an occult ovarian cancer at a very early stage that, if this hadn't been found, who knows, maybe that could have progressed and been found at a far later date. So that's the scenario. And I think what's even more helpful that we put in there, or what we hope that people find helpful, is the table that's kind of in the middle of the guide, where we walk through, because again, there isn't a one size fits all, right? So we walk through, what are some of the things that should be considered. So in the in the case, we kind of highlight, how they consider these different things and address them. But in the table, we kind of leave them as more kind of open-ended questions and the potential practical implications. So, things like, how are you going to do your data analysis? Are you going to handle the CLIA confirmation yourself? Do you have the ability to pay for that through your study? Are you going to have the, study participants pay for it through their insurance? Kind of what does that look like? What results are you going to return? What results are you looking for? What type of testing are you doing? What's the time frame for returning the results? How are you going to communicate the results to the participants? How are you going to help them coordinate follow-up care if you're going to do that? Data storage and access. So, I think we could all sit and talk forever about all of these sorts of things. And I think we want to leave time for kind of maybe drilling down into the areas that people are most interested in. But we, in this guide, kind of highlighted some of what we thought were really the key aspects. And then within each of those key aspects, some of the key questions that are most helpful to think about, again, as kind of on the front end and proactively as possible, so that you don't find yourself in a situation where you're in a scenario where you haven't thought about this. And now, you have an actionable result that you've found in the course of your research. And well, we didn't, discuss this with the participant. We don't have it in the consent. Can we now ethically return this? Can we recontact them, right? If we can address more of this on the front end, it can often help with that. And so we kind of summarize that in the key takeaways as well. And I think also since we've come out with this guide, there's also been some additional things that many of you are probably aware of that I think are really, take this even further and get even more granular with it. One of the things that I looked most forward to was the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, the NASEM. They came out with a really, really nice guidance on returning individual research results to participants. I was fortunate enough to be a part of some of those meetings, and I think their guide for individuals that are kind of thinking through this for their own research or clinical studies, it's a very valuable resource. And one thing in particular I really want to highlight that I kind of like from that when we're thinking through for some of our studies, what types of results we're going to return. They have a really nice figure in there that kind of has, on two axes, the relative clinical importance of a type of result, and then the ease of returning a result from the researcher standpoint or the institutional standpoint. And then they kind of put the different types of results along the spectrum of that. And then they go into kind of the rationale that they had in developing that figure. But that has been really helpful for some of the conversations we've had in our various, research meetings when we're talking about standing up a study and thinking through the types of results that we have and how we're going to return them. Because I think the other big takeaway is there's never going to be a one size fits all, because it depends on your study and what you're even doing, and what you'll even have to return, if anything, and then how you return. So that, in a nutshell, is a walkthrough of the guide. And I think at this point, Sylvia, we'd probably want to stop here and maybe take some questions, or we can talk about various aspects of the guide if there's things people would like to go into.
Well, one question that came up already was whether we can find that link to the NASEM guidance. So we can definitely try to do that and get that out to everybody today in the chat and to our attendees. Obviously when we've been talking about this, so much of this is the preparation, and it even goes, to some extent, the big question that comes up always is like a funding question. Well, I don't have the funds to do this. So I'm often thinking about how we can really build this better into that planning and preparation, even when we're putting in our funding applications. Have you seen any change or momentum or movement around really having people build this into, or having it asked within grant applications or whatever about returning information, and whether there's a plan and whether there's a budget line item for it?
Yeah, I think there's increasingly a movement towards this in the field of genetics and genomics. as genetic testing becomes increasingly common, right? And as also we see this shift in the research world where we really, participants are partners in the research, and they're telling us that they want this information. And to a certain degree, especially with kind of actionable secondary findings, there's arguably an ethical duty to return those if they're going to have a big clinical impact to a patient. So if we're going to be doing any sort of sequencing that's going to be finding these things, I think there's a really reasonable conversation. There's a conversation to be had about why wouldn't we return them? And I think we're increasingly going there. And so again, this comes back to this idea of really kind of thinking about this on the front end. So obviously, if you're working with something like de-identified data, right? Or if you're only going to be doing, kind of like a SNP analysis or GWAS analysis, it's very different than if you're going to be doing, whole exome sequencing of a population of individuals where you're going to be looking in genes that are arguably actionable. This also comes back to, again, I think we could have a conversation of like, well, what's actionable? Right. And broadly, I think there's broad agreement that we don't necessarily as researchers have this duty to hunt, but if we're performing genomic sequencing, there is generally, when we're talking about this, right, we're talking about, and this is another link we can provide, right, but the ACMG AMP has recommendations for reporting secondary findings. That's now up to 73 genes, right? Like that's sort of in the neighborhood of what we're talking about. But then right there, we get into often with investigators and researchers, right? Do they have the expertise of interpreting variants in those genes and the cost that would be involved in kind of that piece, and then also the cost in CLIA confirmation and returning those. And so I think increasingly, though, that is being kind of considered and built into funding mechanisms. I think it's also something increasingly that we're seeing IRBs kind of ask about and look for. And so I think increasingly it is being built into the research plan on the front end, but we're seeing kind of all flavors of that being done. I certainly have come across studies where it's kind of been very explicit to individuals up front that maybe they would need to cover some of the confirmatory genetic testing, but I feel like it's more common that that is covered through the study. But you're right that it's a cost that not everyone is going to be able to handle. But it behooves, again, the researchers to think about that on the front end. And not have themselves in a situation where now they're finding something and they're, scrambling to figure out, well, how do we get this back to the patient and who's going to pay for this? And again, scope of the study comes into play, right? It's one thing if it's a couple individuals or the way that you're doing your sequencing, you're only looking at a couple genes. It's another thing if you're doing a large study and doing whole exome sequencing where all 73 of those genes would be in play, because then the amount of individuals you find with actionable pathogenic or likely pathogenic variants is going to be higher. So some of it you can do the math on, right? You can kind of figure out how many variants are we expecting to have and what does that look like in the return. And then the last thing I'll say is also just the cost goes further into, are you going to have some sort of individual returning those results and or are you going to automate that in some way, right? Who's writing your report and returning those results and supporting those patients and getting them to follow-up care? That can also play into costs.
Well, and so those 73, is that the ACMG list right now? So like when we were thinking about our tools for individual return of results in genetics and all results, in fact, it was like researchers really need to take a step back and really go through the exercise. I mean, it sounds really almost pedantic to say it, but like, what is the data that my study is generating? And whether it's like simple stuff like you're getting blood pressure and you're getting like some of these vitals or whatever, things that you could be returning. This is, again, not genetics, but like the idea of like, what data points am I collecting that are potentially interesting or meaningful to my participants or that I can give back to them? And how, and which are the ones where it starts to get more difficult? It might affect analyses. So we have to wait in terms of timing and all this. And then how, once I have my sort of list of all these data points and which are reasonable and which ones do I have to think about and which ones can I, but after, and which ones might need secondary, like CLIA certified testing or whatever, then you can get into, well, and how am I going to communicate this all to my participants? And so I'm starting to see some questions coming from the audience. And so one question also was like, there are no slides, so don't worry, we are just talking. There are no slides today. This is a case study discussion, drilling deeper. And so, this kind of ties into something we were talking about before, Megan. Labs, there may be labs that don't have direct access to a genetic counselor. Is there always a need for a genetic counselor when returning genetic test results? And how can a lab with limited resources incorporate the guidance of a genetic counselor, and when should they? And so this is really interesting because this also ties into some of the stuff we've seeing a big movement towards decentralized clinical trials, people getting results online, information coming. So like, how do you think about these responsibilities, and how can people maybe do the right thing even on a maybe more limited budget?
Yeah, I think scaling this is crucial, right? Especially if we're talking about some of these large population genomics studies, right? It's even if you do have a genetic counselor, right, you need to staff like an army of genetic counselors if you were going to give individual genetic counseling to everyone. And I think we've seen some really nice, really scalable solutions coming forward from various different studies. There's lots of different models out there, but I think one that's really nice that we've utilized to some degree is using not only genetic counselors, right, but kind of all of your informed specialists to develop modules. So like whether those are online modules or, written materials or videos, right? So that the patients can get some degree of genetic counseling that's kind of, not from an individual genetic counselor, that can handle some of the, some of either the pre or post, result aspects. And then, that way you can make sure that they kind of have all of the information that they need. And then also providing them potentially, depending on what the study resources, with kind of an ability to access kind of a provider or genetic counselor if they have more detailed needs or questions. And we need, I think more data on this is welcome, but there is some preliminary data coming out in the studies that are utilizing these models that are showing that these patients that are going through kind of like an automated, like high throughput genetic counseling experience in this way, their retention is good, their knowledge is good, right? So as long as they're getting that information, if they're able to access it in that way, they're utilizing it, and it seems to be, giving them the same level of knowledge as an individual genetic counseling session would be. I think it is crucial though to have, and again, I often say like genetic counseling doesn't have to be a genetic counselor, right? It's the aspect of talking to them about the genetics results. So whoever your knowledgeable providers are, but there should be some sort of knowledgeable provider at the institution that's helping you kind of come up with those materials and helping you come up with a plan. And there should be ideally a way for those individuals that do have more questions or have edge cases, or especially those with the positive results, some way for them to have a touch point with a provider at some point so that they can make sure that they are really understanding those results and getting the follow-up that they need for them.
Well, and so a big question that comes up, and I'm seeing it in themes in a few questions. I'm going to do my best to try to bring people's questions together too, which is around, and now my brain just like froze for a second. Preparing participants to receive the information. So it sounds like, we're talking about videos and other information and everything, but there's also like the real practical things to consider about whether or not they really want to know this, what it means to get the information. It ties into what implications that information could have for their family members, but also for insurance. I'm seeing a question about insurance. And so like, I can already, I think, answer that, genetic testing and these things are not supposed to have an impact on health insurance, but will potentially have an impact on life and disability insurance down the road. So sort of what kinds of preparation people should be doing even before they venture out on that pathway at all. They might want to be getting things organized in their own personal lives around life and disability insurance before they even go down the testing pathway. And if that's even within the scope of what you talk about in the context of research and genetic testing and research and possible secondary findings. So that was a lot right there, but I think it's the main question is around like preparing participants to make the decision on whether they want information, and what implications that information can really have for them and insurance and their families.
Yeah. And we talk about this a little bit in the guide as well, right? Like, so this is part of the front end of the, the patient should be consenting to this and should be aware as they're walking into a research study if there is a potential for return of information. And they should be getting that information up front so that they can be making an informed consent decision on that. And so part of the informed consent should have a mention of the insurance piece that was mentioned as part of this, right? So in every consent form that I work on, right, we put in information and language around GINA, or the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. I think you said it, and it might have been in someone's comment, right, that GINA protects against health insurance. But actually, there's a couple exceptions there, right? So employers of less than 15 employees are technically exempt. And then there are other, exemptions. So life insurance and disability, like we mentioned, GINA does also not, it doesn't apply to U.S. military, Veterans Administration, in the Indian Health Service, and then federal employees that are using FEHB. And there are some other laws that kind of come into play and protect, but you're right that, there are some exemptions to this, to the protections that are in place. So we lay all that out in the informed consent so that people can kind of see that as part of the consent. And if they have questions or concerns, they have an opportunity to pause there and ask those questions. Mm-hmm. Individuals who are, concerned about life insurance or disability or those types of things may want to pause, and not enroll in that research at that time until they have those things sort of lined up. They may want to opt out of receiving the genetic results if that's an option, right? So that's another piece that's not a one size fits all, is, and that would need to be decided. Are you going to give individuals the right to opt out of receiving genetic information? Some, and we talk about this again in the guide too, some studies will choose to offer like a tiered consent, right? So does the participant want only information relating to the research question, right? Does the participant want anything that would have a clinical implication? And generally that's kind of where research stops. But on the clinical end, sometimes there's also like, does the participant want, anything, like even, like uncertain results or things like that. So that should be part of the informed consent process so that people know those sorts of risks and those potential things and have it. And then there needs to be a way for them, again, if that's being done through like an online module or something, there needs to be a way for them to get more information about their concern, or, to speak to a person potentially, if that's an option for them, so they can discuss that and make a decision.
Yes, and I
answered all the questions.
I think that was like a multi-part question. If I missed anything, if we missed anything, just shout it out, in the chat there, because I think what I wanted to highlight, we're very much US focused right now, right? We're talking about returning results, with an NCI genetic counselor here, within a US context. So those of you who are attending from sort of around the world, kind of thinking about what are the sort of you might have universal healthcare if you're in Canada or whatever. What are the implications in Canada when you have research testing, and that's maybe part of an overall, could eventually go into a clinical record that's sort of not separate from research or whatever. So just thinking through that, wherever you might be, there might be different policies and considerations around like what data, where it's living, and whether it has implications for things like insurance down the road. And so we can only sort of speak to the US context right now, but it's something to think about in other contexts as well. And so there are a couple of IRB type questions, and I don't know if you ever deal with this sort of, Kelly asked, if the researcher didn't propose a plan, what is the IRB's role? Or I guess, does the IRB have a role in suggesting, advising, or requiring researchers to plan for providing secondary results, sort of based on the criteria of approval? So they're really looking at the regs there too. So that's getting really detailed. But have you seen that sort of be a place where we could potentially leverage as well, having IRBs ask about it and review plans?
Yeah, I think, and again, I don't think there's any standard to this that I'm aware of, but certainly I have seen IRBs rightfully, like, bring that up, and maybe even at some institutions take a more proactive stance in saying, hey, for our human subjects research studies moving forward, what is the institutional responsibility for this, and can we have more of an institutional policy around kind of our thoughts on this. But again, that is also, it's all challenging, because individual researchers, again, are not always going to have the expertise to analyze and return non-primary findings outside of their research, right? They're not regularly going to be conducting the research in a CLIA environment. All of these things that are kind of needed for returning actionable results. I think, but I think the IRB can certainly help. It goes both ways, right? The IRB can also certainly help guide a researcher in when they're coming up with their protocol, and to think through some of these aspects and what's going to be the most appropriate for the given situation. There was something you said right at the beginning of that I wanted to touch on, and I lost it with the second part. Hopefully it'll come back to me.
I don't know either now, but that's okay.
Yeah.
We might come back to it. And it's interesting. There's a question here that talks about participant age. And so we've actually talked a little bit, and maybe you want to talk about sort of minors and sort of dealing with minors and return of results, and like in genetic testing, and if there's different considerations. And this question here also talks about folks who might be older, and so they're in their 70s, and any pathogenic variants have likely already manifested. So would you return in, what are some thoughts, on returning in those cases as well? And again, we're getting very specific, and it's probably, and it depends, and,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Well, and I remembered what I was going to say. The first half of the other question was, like, what do you do if you haven't made a plan?
Yeah.
Right. And then can the IRB help you with that? I think, and again, this is what we're trying to stress, is to try in all cases to avoid that, right? Because if you have not put it in your protocol, not put it in the consent, not talked with the participant about it at all, and you're doing research, and then you do find, an actionable variant that you then are saying, oh, well, this might be important. Then, that debate is, that's a valid question, but then I think it does become a little bit more sticky in what to do, right? And that's usually when then we're bringing in the ethics board, right? And we're bringing in the IRB, and we're, bringing in the research team, and we have to then discuss again, all the nuances of the situation, like what do we do? And what's going to be the best route for this? And so as much as we can kind of proactively address these things up front, it's much more ideal than kind of being in that situation of, oh, we didn't think about this and now it's happening. Because especially if you're doing any sort of, large scale genomics on, identifiable linked data, you just have to think, is that potential there? And if it is, what are we going to do? And thinking about it ahead of time is far better than on the back end.
In my experience, it's been many years since I've worked within an IRB myself, but I do remember that the application would ask if any individual results, could be, if there would be information that's generated that could be meaningful to participants, and if there's a plan to return it. And there's sort of different ways that applications have asked that. And I think there is a little bit of a movement, and I know there's some IRB folks on this call. So if you have any comments on it, you can also drop them in the chat. But I think there's a bit of a movement to ask investigators and have a plan for it. I think the days of just saying, well, I'm not returning and period, without at least any kind of justification, or I am returning and period, and not having some sort of a plan around well, what's that really going to look like, are kind of in the past. And I think now we're trying to move towards having these more meaningful pieces. So the IRB can play a role in it, and can ask about it, because it is, I think, part of protecting participants as well, if you aren't or are planning to return, in terms of what it can mean for them to be getting that information or not.
Yeah. And I think philosophically, right, like we shied away from using definitions for all of these things in the guide for a reason, which is frustrating for all of us, right? But we can get into this debate of what we mean when we're using all these terms we're using during this, right? Secondary findings and actionable, right? Like one of the things that I always think about personally is like, what does actionable really mean? I think we always think about it as clinically actionable. But you know, I think it's interesting to think about it from the standpoint of like personally actionable, right? Because it may be a variant in a gene that leads to an incurable disease. So that's maybe not medically actionable, right, per se, but knowing about it could enable me to do some planning for my future, right? Or install wheelchair ramps, or so I think actionable is a very personal word and a very sticky word. And then I think then we get into the practical real world aspects of like what it means to do research studies, right? And what researchers are obligated to do. So there's a lot of kind of competing interests there, and a lot of I think a whole other conversation we can have about that. And then also this idea of, what do we mean when we say secondary findings, and being kind of purposely vague about that. I think you will note that we were very deliberate in not saying that it was incidental findings, right? Yeah. So there's been this sort of move away from describing them as incidental findings. And actually Ellen Clayton, who's a very big in the space, and has a lot of wonderful work in this area. She had an anecdote that she used like years ago in a meeting that I feel like, I use it a lot because I love it. And it was that, when you're, an incidental finding is like when you stumble upon Klinefelter syndrome, when you're doing a gender check on chromosomes. It's not when you're, systematically doing whole exome sequencing where you're going to be looking at all the ACNG genes, right? That's not incidental. That's more, it's a secondary finding, but that you may find it, right? So kind of addressing that up front. So that's kind of, I think, just some grounding for just all of the guide and the conversations that we're having.
Well, and that kind of ties in, there's some questions here. Well, I will get back to the age question. So just,
yes,
we were waiting for it, so don't worry, but I wanted to continue this way because there's the questions about the opt-out, right? And so first of all, and there's questions about tiered consent. And so it kind of comes kind of together, because tiered consent is kind of like choosing what it is, being able to, first of all, for researchers to explain what the types of data could be, and in such a clear way that participants are able to consent to, well, yeah, I'd want this, or I wouldn't want this, and sort of thinking about the opt-outs. And so I wonder if you want to comment a little bit more around the sort of thinking behind how you define all this, and because what you just highlighted was like what's actionable to some person might not be to another, or there's sort of some space, there's some room for interpretation. How do you think about these opt-outs and these tiers of consent? And then tangentially, I know I'm doing these two-part questions. Let's start there. What do you think about this?
Well, and again, I think there isn't like, as far as I'm aware, and I'd love, but there isn't, a one size fits all. There isn't the answer to this. And so I think to a certain degree, it does come down to, a lot of individual aspects, which I feel like a broken record saying that. I know personally for a lot of our study, because again, the return of secondary findings is inarguably important, but it is also, the primary aim is to do our research, right? Which is, often not at all, what we're doing with the secondary findings. So to that end too, I think we are busy research institutions, often with limited bandwidth. And so sometimes it's the simplest route may be the better for individuals. I know, we were talking about tiered consents and opt-out. Another option that is utilized, right, is to just say in the consent and the protocol, right, we may find in the course of your research a secondary finding that would be, important to your, health, and just letting them know that, there's no, do you want to know? Do you not want to know? It's as simple as that, right? And then because you're having to do that second step of CLIA confirmation anyway. And so instead of having the opt out there, it's kind of a default opt in. And then when the individual is contacted to say, hey, we found something in the course of research, if they really don't want to know, at that point, they can say, I don't want to know, right? And or opt to not give you a blood sample to or a sample to CLIA confirm. And then they're kind of, so you're still enabling that without all of these like nuances in the consent that you then have to like spend study admin on to kind of follow up on.
Right.
But there are some studies that are giving this because they want that granularity and they're able to do it, or it's part of the research. So certainly it's possible, but it doesn't have to happen.
In that, yes, and that was sort of my fault. The administrative, there's some challenges with the administrative tracking of this, and so we've also seen that individual results could be available in the future, and then you can choose at that time whether to receive that information. Which of course, like, I would be so bad if somebody contacted me later. I'd be like, of course I want to know, even though I might normally would not want that.
And thinking through, right? So we're also very explicit that this is, it's research. We don't, for some samples that we're banking, I don't know when we'll sequence them, if we ever sequence them. So making sure that you're managing their expectations that, hey, we may be taking your sample to do research, but it may not be for years, or it may not be ever. And so, don't expect that if your study is designed in this way, don't expect this to be, that you're getting a call in a week with research result, with any sorts of results. If you don't, and we make it very clear, if you don't get contacted by us, that doesn't mean that there's nothing there, and if there's a concern, please, go to a provider to get a workup, right? Because that's not what we're doing with this research. It's just that if we happen to look at and we happen to find it, we will get in touch with you. But we don't want them thinking, oh, I never got a call from that research study, so that means that my genes are fine, right? So just being clear with that in the language of your consent. And then, thinking through kind of some of these things that you just touched upon, right? Like all of these kind of edge cases that can kind of come up. And
which we love to talk about, the edge cases, right? That's what ends up happening. There is some thought and questions about sort of the biorepository space, right? So we've been talking very much about studies that have a very specific aim, and we know exactly what we're going to be looking for or whatever. How have you had any experience or thoughts around biorepositories and maybe needing to present future unknown, possibly actionable results, or do biorepositories don't really touch on this? And when we think about it years down the road, like, is there any obligation to be reporting to relatives maybe down the road if the participant is deceased?
Yeah. So again, I think that needs to be part of the plan up front. So, right, all of these sorts of edge cases of divorced parents or, a minor that then ages up, but you've already returned to the parents, or, misattributed parentage, or, someone that's passed away through the process of it. Again, like all of those things, to a certain degree, like you should just kind of be clear in the protocol, so you're, everyone's on the same page with what you're going to do in that case, and that your kind of institution has kind of signed off on that. And then, again, I think it comes down to so one of the things that we have looked at in the past, when we're kind of thinking through scenarios of when return of results is appropriate, is kind of this, a partial entrustment model for like a framework for analyzing whether the researchers would have an ethical obligation to provide ancillary care, and within that, right, would be potentially return of secondary findings. So again, cases where the data is de-identified, right, or even like a biobank case where it's a mail-in questionnaire and the patient has sent off one sample and they have no, contact with the research team. The research is really limited to, de-identified sample, offsite things, is a different entrustment model, right, than someone who's like regularly interacting with a treatment team, or a study team, and their PII is collected, and there's just like these different degrees that one can imagine in these different scenarios where you could kind of think about, is there an obligation to return findings, right, in these cases. And so, again, there isn't yet again the theme of the day, right, but there isn't a one size fits all answer, but we kind of look at these different scenarios to say, a large scale population health study where participants are kind of filling out, questionnaires, but there's no direct engagement. Maybe that's going to be a different situation than where we've, told them like, hey, we're going to sequence your DNA, right? They would be expecting something different than someone who's just participating in a biobank.
Right. And I think, Sandy brings up a good point just around when there's whole genome sequencing used for hypothesis generation, you might not be interrogating actionable genes in this way, sort of to look for clinical findings. So, you might need to provide interpretation of important findings that could be meaningful, which might fall outside of the research scope. So this is just sort of like an FYI again. So planning, again, if you're doing that kind of work, may need to include additional costs around researchers taking the right steps to be able to help with that interpretation of the findings that are not part of those like 73 in the list, and how that might impact sort of participants moving forward. So that was more of a statement I wanted to make sure I touched on. And then, as we're wrapping up, just going back to the age question, around do your thoughts change on, if somebody's already kind of aged out of the impact, whatever's been manifested has likely already manifested on the older side of the spectrum. And then how do you think about genetic testing and returning of results in minors? And we did talk a bit about aging up and consenting again, or getting the results, but
yeah, the aging up and consenting again is kind of, I think, more of an individual approach that I have personally seen go both ways, right? A lot of individuals, they have to they've been assenting, right? And then they have to consent onto the study if they're going to continue as an adult. As far as results that have been returned to the parents of a minor, generally, again, when we're talking about kind of this like return of secondary findings, generally, again, we want to keep the burden on the researchers low. So generally, it's, again, I don't think there's a right answer, but generally I've seen it be acceptable that it's, you returned it to the parents while the child was a minor. There's no obligation on the research team to now go back and return those results to the adult participant that have already been the research secondary findings to the adult participant. As far as genetic testing in minors, so there is some broader guidance around genetic testing in minors in the field of genetics and genomics. And like anything else, that has kind of shifted over time, right? So generally we have for conditions that affect, children, generally it's kind of widely accepted that, and again, talking from more of a clinical standpoint, right? That we would do clinical genetic testing for for pediatric conditions in children. Mm-hmm. When we've gotten into the adult onset genetic conditions and testing children for those, generally the field has kind of approached that in generally opting not to do that in most cases, right? Because we want to preserve autonomy, and there are the insurance concerns and, the choice of the child and sort of these other pieces. But, like anything else, there has been sort of more of a debate around that over time as genetic testing has become more common. If the parents really want to know and their well-being, how are children doing with this information kind of as they age, it could help other family members. So those sorts of things. So again, it's another place where there's no right answer. And I think this is where we all have to, be informed individuals that are making the right choice and kind of having that conversation with those families. So from a research standpoint, I think all of those things apply even more so, right? And would, again, be something that you want to very carefully walk into when you're preparing your protocol and your consent, and just be aware of where things exist in the clinical space and kind of abstract that to whatever your kind of research study is and the aims of that study and your patient population and kind of their expectations. And I think it would just be everything that we've been saying for adults, but even more nuanced and applying that even more carefully.
Awesome.
And I will just say, to that end, I know we're coming to the end, but I think the other big thing in this whole field is much more data needed on what are people doing with this, right? So we're having all of these conversations around return of secondary findings, but and people want them, but what are they doing with it, right? Are they actually getting proactive care? Is this improving their outcomes? What are providers doing with this? There's some really great work out of NHGRI where they're looking at this. Lots of researchers kind of all over looking at this, and this is really needed information. And I think, just answering the pediatric question had me thinking that as well, right? Because I think there's some unique questions in that population, but we really don't know across the board. We're talking a lot about the front end stuff, but it'd be really interesting to see kind of what this is doing on the back end and with outcomes.
And I think we're going to see a lot more of that kind of being looked at moving forward, since there is much more of a move to be trying to return data and results to people. So it is the top of the hour. And so, Megan, there were so many more questions we could have gone through. Thank you, everyone who submitted questions. We tried to answer them here. Feel free to reach out if you have more questions. Please go to the website. Our website has a lot of tools and resources there to help guide you through what to return, how to return, all of those things, and really walk through that. And I just appreciate everyone's interest and support of this 3-part series. Megan, final rounding it up for us. Really appreciate you and your expertise and your time today, Megan, and just we think you're great. So thanks so much for doing this with us today. And I wish everybody a happy transition, into the next season. And good luck with all your work and research.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was great. Thank you. Thanks, Megan. I'm going to see if we can stop the recording.